Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update with State Representative Tesha Buss. My name is Tom Ayres. I'm senior staff writer with the Vermont Standard newspaper, and this is part of our series of weekly legislative updates here on Okemo Valley TV. Hello again, Tesha. It's nice to see you. It's been a couple of weeks since I've been together with you.
Yes, great to be here, Tom. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So this is a particularly momentous time in the legislative process each year in Vermont. It's what we in the media and our political and community leaders know as crossover time. But talk a little bit about crossover time briefly and what that is for the general public. What does it mean to have crossover time in the legislature?
Sure. So when we start each session, we receive bills that come to each committee. And then as a committee, we can choose what we want to take up or not take up. We receive a lot of testimony. You can't just have a great idea. That idea has to be supported by testimony on both sides, for or perhaps against the argument, so that we can know how to put a bill together that's presented to the House as a whole. And when it goes to the House as a whole, it has to go out, be voted out of your committee by a certain date to get to the floor of the House. And then the House has to vote that out in order for it to go to the Senate. And then the Senate correspondingly does the same thing. So sometimes, like for instance, you may have heard that childcare is going to start in the Senate and paid family medical leave will start in the House. And then we will during crossover, vote those out into the different legislative body for them to take a look at that bill and overall philosophy and policy that will hopefully be voted into law.
And then you reconcile the disparate pieces of legislation and come to agreement on what the final pieces are going to be.
That's right. And we've actually already done that with the Budget Adjustment Act. So the budget, gets voted out at the end of every legislative session, but then halfway through the year, it's looked at again. And then, some parts of it, some organizations won't need as much as they thought. So they will do a reversion and put it back into the money that anybody can go after and use. And other people will use more money than we thought that they would use. So then when we did the budget adjustment, the House had one idea, the Senate had a different idea. And so we had to do what's called a committee of conference. And if you, so the Speaker of the House and the pro tem of the Senate will put a number of people on that committee and they will duke it out essentially and really take, then they'll make the final decision as to what budget or a budget adjustment or whatever the bill is. That conference committee will make that ultimate decision and then bring it back to both bodies to be hopefully voted through.
So before we move on to talk about some of the major pieces of legislation that are moving through crossover right now, one quick question: what determines which chamber a particular piece of legislation originates in? Is that just sort of organic, or do you have a common understanding or a conference prior to generating legislation where you say, we'll let this come from the House, we'll let this come from the Senate? How does that work?
I might be too much of a freshman to be able to completely answer your question, but it does seem to be that that the pro tem and the Speaker of the House basically take their own political priorities or the priorities that. So, after we got elected, we had a lot of focus groups where different parts of the state got together and we basically expressed, here's what our voters said were the most important things that we needed to address as a legislature. And then we distilled all those down and those became our democratic priorities for the House. And so I'm not for sure if that's what Jill Kowinski used or if this is also in tandem with, priorities that have been going on for some time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's talk about some of those priorities. You and I chatted briefly via email over the weekend about what some of the major pieces of legislation are that are moving through this transitional period right now. What do you see as the 3 or 4 most critical pieces of legislation from your perspective that are in crossover um, right now?
Yes, paid family medical leave for sure. The House has a very robust plan. It would cost an employer about $125 a year, each employee $125 a year, or the employer could choose to pay for all of that. And then that would be 90% of your paycheck. And it's up to 12 weeks for certain medical conditions. It can also be used, let's say you have cancer, you may not need continuous leave, but you might need 2 days per week to go through chemo and to recover from it
Hmm.
for a substantial amount of time. So it's definitely a very robust plan. And it's available to anyone, even independent contractors, which is important because they're not
Absolutely.
employed.
Right, right.
So they don't have unemployment that they can rely upon. And independent policies are way more expensive than even a $250 total.
Oh, for certain, for certain. So paid medical leave. Um, what are some of the other things that
Yeah,
are also
childcare
uh-huh.
is huge. That has started in the Senate, but we've been trying to keep our eyes on it over in the House. Um, there the discussion was, could we take 4-year-olds and put them in the public school system to alleviate the pressures in the childcare system? But there's a lot of complicating factors to that because many schools do not have an after school program at the school. So then parents would be dropping their kid off at 8, picking them up around 2:30. That presents equal challenges to working parents. And for
Hmm.
folks that wouldn't be able to do that, if they wanted to keep their kid in the childcare center, would they then still be able to be allowed to be in the public pre-K program? So there's a lot of unanswered questions in
Absolutely.
childcare.
And I know that childcare is an issue of a special concern and interest of yours. We've had that conversation. You've been involved in the childcare community for quite some time. Um, Here's a question I've thought of. Is part of the discussion about childcare on site in schools possibly developing school-based childcare pre-K and after-school programs? Is that something that's in the mix, or is it not really an option?
I don't sit on the Human Services Committee to
Yeah.
know whether or not that has been addressed much. But I'll tell you the conflict of the confabulation here is that
Yeah.
Child Development Division, which regulates child cares, and the Agency of Education um, do operate in conflicting manner. And
Mhm.
that is what they definitely decided that if you want to keep pre-K going, you should create an organization that just does pre-K so that you don't have those conflicts between Child Development Division and the Agency of Education.
Exactly.
And so I feel that might be the root of the pain pill, if you will, for being able to figure that out. If they did create this separate governing body, then hopefully it would not matter if you house them in or out of a school. But I'm not privy to enough detail to tell you how far along that conversation
Hmm.
has
Hmm.
gotten yet.
Hmm. Absolutely. Let's move on to another topic. In our communication over the weekend, you suggested that uh, statewide appraisals are going to be a major item on the agenda over the remainder of the legislature. And certainly, those of us who are homeowners, taxpayers, are waiting with bated breath to find out what's happening with our appraisals. So, can you update us on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, to give you a tiny bit of relief, it's going to be a study. So, we're going
Ah,
to study it first, as we do in the legislature. Um, I think the root of really where this is all coming from are the vast amount of towns that don't have enough listers running for office, enough
Mhm.
town clerks running for office. We have more appointed positions and more towns moving towards appointed positions than ever before, because there is this general lack of wanting to step up into public service. I'm not for sure where all of it stems from. I mean, a busy life is certainly an easy one to target. And also, it is intense to receive negative feedback. So who knows all the different reasons for that. But because of that, we have less people running for office. And then we have an increasingly intense computerized system that
Mhm.
requires technical training.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the main reason why, if it's so, most other states in the nation have towns that are the size of the population of Vermont. And so what happens is we hire an appraisal company to come in and say, reappraise the town of Plymouth, and they kind of chuckle and say, this is way too small for us. We can't take on this job.
Mhm.
And so a lot of folks have not, it's a lot of towns have not been appraised for that reason. And so the thought is, if you take it over on a statewide basis, you are going to be way more efficient, and we can do certain sections of the state on a rolling basis so that it just continues, and to make sure that our appraisal process is happening in a systematic and detailed way.
Mhm.
But the sticking point is, who is going to handle appeals? Because you can't have locals handling an appeal of something that they had no part in creating.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that
Absolutely.
is the real sticking point, and where I believe that the studies will have to focus the most of their work on.
Okay. Okay. Great explanation. Thank you. Um, and relieved to hear that a study is going to be undertaken before we move in this direction. Um, uh, for sure.
Yeah, we
Well,
don't have enough manpower to do any faster anyway.
and then two other topics I'd like to touch on briefly that you and I have conversed about. One is an issue that I know came up last year, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe the governor vetoed it, and that is the rental registry. Um,
Yes, the rental registry is back on. We passed it out of the House. It would be that everyone would register. It's $35 for an annual registration. This is for short-term and long-term rentals alike.
okay.
The philosophy behind the registry, which I can really get behind, is that we really need to know where rental locations are and their capacity, in order for us to know where to focus our housing, energy, and resources.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's equally as important to know, in the short-term rental market, a lot of towns have used an exceptional amount of resources to create short-term rental registries that they're having a hard time continuing to staff. There are, I know that in Woodstock, there are a significant number of people that have been on the registry that have not renewed, and then you've got to track them down. To do this all at a small town level is
Yeah,
challenging as well. It's the same as the appraisal issue.
sure.
Um,
It
and
falls on it falls on Chief Green's shoulders and David Green's shoulders in Woodstock alone to track all of that. Maybe with the
it's a tall
assistance.
order.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And they're being regulated so differently. There's a house in Plymouth that the fee is going to be over $1,000, and that same house in Woodstock would be the flat fee of 75. So it's also, when you look at it from if you call short-term rentals a business, which, my personal opinion is that they are,
Hmm.
you advertise to everyone in the world that you can house them. That's pretty much a business.
Hmm.
That we should be regulating it on a more consistent and statewide level. And
Hmm.
I know that regulation can be challenging, but I think asking each town to do it individually is also not the right solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then end on a somewhat of a somber note, perhaps, but nonetheless a very critical issue for our state, particularly for our youths: suicide prevention.
Yes.
What is on the legislative table as far as that goes?
I mean, it is safe storage in a house where there are children present,
Mhm,
100%.
absolutely.
Um, all of the statistics state that if the youth did not have access, then they would not have committed suicide. And we know this from the kids that did attempt and were not successful, and they typically do not retry. But in that moment where they're struggling, when they have access, it increases. I mean, you're 4 times more likely.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's the biggest part of it, is to get that safe storage in there,
Uh,
and the waiting period.
is the legislature facing pressure from sportsmen's groups and things like that? The pro-gun advocates, so to speak, anti-gun control advocates, so to speak, even on this issue of safe storage?
Yes, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Yes. And and then the thing that was mentioned significantly with the waiting period is, if you are already a gun owner, do you have to wait 72 hours each and every time? And those are the details that I think will continue to be shaken out as
Hmm.
it moves through the Senate. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. And a byproduct of this, a tangential byproduct of this is, in a way, addressing the concern of youth access to unlocked or not safely stored weapons, and the impact that might have on school violence too, in some respects. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it was even discussed in terms of safe storage in our committee, with being, if you transport your gun to school and you just had, you're hunting, or you're a law enforcement officer and you go to pick up your child, your gun isn't going to be in a locked safe in the back of
Hmm.
your truck or car. It's probably going to be on you because you're still on duty or you're coming from duty. And that was even still brought up because there was a bill put forth, because you are allowed to bring a gun onto school property as long as you have no intent to harm. But that is a very slippery slope. How do you
Absolutely.
define intent to harm? I mean, obviously, if you're a police officer, that's debatable. But if you just went out, hunting in the morning and you drop your kid off at school, yes, you don't have an intent to harm, but you don't know if your child could grab it because he or she has the intent to harm. And when does that intent to harm activate for all of us?
Hmm.
It could be after a
Absolutely.
phone call. It could be after an altercation at school. So there are so many questions to answer. And one of the things that was brought up a lot in safe storage is that we do have an amazing amount of safes now that are very easy to open. You can open them with a fingerprint. If you are a person, if you if you are sleeping in your bed and you want to have your gun on your nightstand and children are in the house, but you're monitoring that because it's right next to you, these are the kind of things that were being discussed on the House floor.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's so many permutations and so much uh, kind of getting into the weeds, but
Oh,
it's
yeah.
it's a challenging it's a challenging issue without a question. Well, Tesha, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. I thank you on behalf of our listeners and our viewers for sort of illuminating the whole crossover process for us. And we'll look forward in coming weeks as the legislature winds down to seeing how all of these pieces of legislation play out. And look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thanks for having me on, Tom. It's good to be here.